Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Richard Howard, the Global Research Director at Aurora Energy Research. On this episode, we'll be zooming right out to look at the big picture scenarios for decarbonisation of the global economy. We want to consider what it takes to limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees and how our energy system and economy needs to evolve to get there. These sorts of questions are best tackled through scenario analysis, and I'm joined today by two guests who are both deeply involved in these sorts of energy scenario analyses. Firstly, I'm joined by a real grandee of the energy industry who spent more than 3 decades at the forefront of energy market and financial analysis. He's currently the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at Equinor, one of the world's largest oil and gas companies, and also one of the largest companies in Scandinavia, which he first joined in 2003 under its previous name of Statoil. He leads on the group's energy market policy and macroeconomic analysis, and in this role has been responsible for no less than 12 editions of the group's Energy Perspectives scenario analysis. I'm joined today by Eirik Wærness. And Eirik, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Very good. I am also joined in this episode by Anise Ganbold, who's head of research at Aurora, covering our global energy markets, commodity analysis, and also hydrogen. And Anise's team is currently leading on Aurora's own global scenario analysis, which will be released in late September 2023. Also, Anise, welcome to the podcast.
Great. Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to focus on the Energy Perspectives report. And before we get straight into it and actually, Eirik, ask you to pull out some of the key insights from that, I was quite interested in sort of motivation for your organization, Equinor, to produce the Energy Perspectives report. So why is it that one of the major oil and gas companies is doing this sort of work? You're not the only one. BP and Shell also do similar analysis, but what is your motivation? And also, how do you think about sort of the unique contribution that this scenarios analysis makes versus other similar reports?
Yeah, well, the motivation, I guess, there are several reasons why we do this. We do the work anyway as a large energy company, and my responsibility is to provide analysis that makes it possible for the decision makers in the company to make very long-term investment decisions, and therefore we have to make up our mind about what's the likely and possible way forward for the different energy markets that we're in. Then doing this in a report is a nice way to summarize all that work. It gives us an outlet for what are the assumptions, what do we actually believe in, what has to happen if something is going to be very different than what we think is most likely, etc., etc. So it's a nice way to gather all the analysis, make up our mind about what is it that we really think, check for consistencies. Then the reason why we do it externally is also that this is part of our license to operate. Increasingly over the last decades, energy companies have been challenged to also explain why we are energy companies. Why do we produce energy? How do we do it? How can we make it more sustainable? And then for a company of our size, we need to participate in the debate around the energy transition, hopefully contributing to a fact-based discussion on the possibilities of decarbonization, what does it take, etc., etc. So that's why we do this. It works very well as a communication tool, both internally and externally as well, and it gives us an opportunity to get challenged as well. So being open and transparent on our assumptions make it easier for people to challenge us and to question. So there's a large number of these reports out there now, and I guess there are many scenarios produced by everything from large institutions like IEA or the EIA in the US, policy think tanks as well, and then of course the energy companies. So it's difficult to be unique, but I guess one of the things that stand out in our work is the weight we assign to assumptions on geopolitical variables, the ability or inability to cooperate across the large powers in terms of solving collective problems, collective challenges in a smart and efficient manner. That's one thing that we have assigned a lot of weight to when we develop our scenarios. So that's one part of it. One of the things that we vary across scenarios, for instance, which IEA does not, is that we vary the assumption on economic growth. So we have different assumptions for economic growth in per year, if you like, globally, and also in different regions across different scenarios. IEA does not do that, as an example. So, but of course, it's when you have 100 different scenarios for the future, they're bound to be relatively similar, and we build on the same historical numbers, all of us, right? It's the state of the art. We start out with where the energy system is at the moment, and then we develop trends or lines or assumptions going into the future. So in that sense, it's difficult to stand out.
Yeah. I would say one way I noticed kind of reading back through the back catalogue is actually I can see how the publications have evolved and become a lot more punchy over time. I read the first one and the last one just this morning, and you've gone from kind of quite a long prose-based report to something that's much more sort of pithy summary of what's going on, summarizing the entirety of sort of 30 years of energy transition into a few key charts, which makes it, I guess, really accessible and very much commendable direction of travel. Anise, I wonder,
that's right.
Yeah,
so it's probably a reflection. It's probably a reflection of what social media does to us in terms of communication as well. You know, you have to stay within 240 characters in Twitter, and then that reflects also the size and length of our reports, I guess.
Yeah, tweetable content, absolutely. Anise, I wonder if you could also, while we're here, summarize the work that Aurora has been doing and is doing on different scenarios.
Yeah, sure. Well, the topic of net zero and 2 degrees is something that we've been doing as a company for many years. But this year, we decided to really dive into the topic and tackle what would the world look like if we did manage to reach global 2 degrees warming by the end of the century. We're not saying this is the most likely outcome, but we're putting all the pieces together to see how could this all work? Where could all the assumptions work together without having contradictions? So we're doing that as a huge modeling exercise. As Richard mentioned, we're publishing something in September, but we're really trying to find out is what does the energy world look like? Which countries do we think are first movers? Which countries are laggards? What is the impact of going global 2 degrees on the economy, on energy prices? Will fossil fuel production peak anytime soon? Where is energy demand going to go? Electrification is a big one, given our expertise in the electricity sector. So how big is the electricity sector actually going to get? Where is the power even going to come from? CCS is another topic that we dive into. So will we actually need CCS in order to reach this global 2 degrees? So yeah, really trying to answer how could the world feasibly reach global 2 degrees? So it's a report, not as short as your report, Eirik. It will be probably like 40, 50 slides. But again, trying not to be too text heavy and really just show the implications, the charts, and the results.
Very good. And so I suppose some similarities and differences in both. So we're looking at a 2 degree world in the Aurora case. Eirik will come on to talk about it in just a moment, but you look at a more ambitious 1.5 degree world, and so some key differences there. But in both cases, we're sort of saying, what would you have to believe? It's a sort of normative scenario framework rather than what we think is most likely. Well, maybe let's move us on exactly to that. And Eirik, let's get into the guts of your perspectives of report. And I think a useful place to start is if you could outline those different scenarios that you look at.
Yeah, and in this year's and last year's report, we've limited ourselves to 2 scenarios. One is a forecast scenario. So it's building on current trends, policy developments, and policy promises and policy signals as well. So it's and we call that scenario WALS. It's framed in a setting of massive geopolitical conflict, limits to trade. Sanctions that affects the possibility to exchange and trade in technology, And then how does that impact economic growth, energy demand, energy transition, energy efficiency, and so on. So that's a scenario where we will see the energy transition moving, and it will move rapidly relative to what it has done over the last 30 years, but it will move slightly differently across regions, for instance, depending on the status, the starting point, the development, the political priorities, the access to technology, et cetera, et cetera. That scenario ends up, with CO2 emissions developing towards a carbon concentration that is consistent with probably with a 2.2 degree warming by 2100. We don't model after 2050, so we have to make assumptions on that. But that's where we are, and that's a result. That's not a parameter. That's not an input factor in that scenario. And then we have the other scenario, which is a normative backcast. The question is, what does it take to deliver a carbon concentration and a contribution from the energy sector that is consistent with staying within the 1.5 degree warming with 50% probability towards 2050 and beyond. And we put a very strict requirement on that. We don't allow any overshoot either. There's a lot of scenarios out there that go above 1.5 degree warming under the assumption that you can develop negative carbon capture and storage and negative emissions, if you like, afterwards, and bring the temperature back down. We have not done that in this scenario. This is it's a backcast. We call it bridges as opposed to walls. Bridges are open-ended. They allow for communication. They allow us to bring ourselves to places where we otherwise wouldn't have been. We play on the assumption that, here we have to cooperate. We have to share technology. We have to put in place consistent framework conditions that allow the energy system and the energy users to adapt to this kind of world, irrespective of where it is. A CO2 molecule has the same impact on global warming wherever it's emitted. So that's that type of world. And of course, we do not think it's possible to bring the world towards the 1.5 degree scenario and the target, the 1.5 degree threshold, unless we get into a game of cooperation, a global cooperation. So that's why we call it the bridges.
And we notice across those two scenarios, although the regional pattern of GDP is different, the overall global GDP is assumed to be the same in 2050. Can we take that as a given, or is there a risk sort of in the walls world? We could be, like, if the climate models are correct, we could be spending a lot of money on making up for climate related issues. Whereas in bridges, we would need to invest a huge amount of capital in the solutions to decarbonize the world economy. So it does feel like there might be some differences in outcome there. Can we assume that they're the same?
No, not as a given. I mean, that it's a coincidence, basically, that we end at the same type of GDP level globally in 2050 in the two scenarios. The temporal pattern is also different. We have higher economic growth in the beginning in walls. Part of the reason for that is that the transition, the type of massive energy transition that is needed in the bridges scenario will reduce economic growth, in particular in the industrialized world. We're going to shut down a lot of things that actually have an economic benefit today in order to force the transition. And that has a cost. Vice versa, once you get to 2035, 2040, the climate related costs will be higher in walls than in bridges. And that's one reason why bridges then catch up in terms of GDP level. And of course, if we underestimate that impact, then walls is not going to deliver that type of economic growth towards 2050 and beyond. And similarly, if we underestimate the benefits of a greener economy, a cleaner economy, or underestimate the costs, then the GDP level in bridges will be different as well. Yeah. So that's just a matter of coincidence. Of course, the underlying factors that drive economic growth generally are the same. We don't have different population development, as an example. And of course, a massive driver for long-term economic growth will be number of people. And then it will be people's IQ. It will be the productivity here, and those are the underlying the same type of growth factors. So that's why the economy grows, basically. And then of course it's about capital efficiency and how you put capital and labor together, and that's where you end up with different growth assumptions, both across regions and per year.
Absolutely. I wondered, Eirik, if you can then try and outline. I mean, there's a lot of depth in your analysis, but whether you could summarize what are some of the key topics and key findings from the report?
Yeah, I think I just alluded to some of it. Of course, one of the big uncertainties is how an economic development in terms of increased incomes, increased GDP, and thereby increased purchasing power, how does that affect energy demand? And that's about energy efficiency, energy intensity. Can we provide the same amount of economic services with using much less energy over time? And how quickly can we force that process? How quickly can we have people move to use of energy that allows for higher efficiency, less waste? Over the last 30 years globally, the energy intensity development, which is the flip side of energy efficiency, has been roughly 1% per year, meaning that if GDP grows by 2%, energy demand grows by 1% per year. In the worst case, we think we will increase that rate of efficiency improvement, if you like, almost by 100% or 80% higher per year. And if we're going to go all the way to the 1.5 degree scenario, we'll have to basically decouple energy demand growth from GDP growth, so that the whole economic growth can be delivered without increasing the use of primary energy demand. And that's one key question. And this goes across economies. How quickly can we make the emerging parts of the world as efficient as we are in the West? Can that be done? Then some other highlights, of course, if you're concerned with it, since we're concerned with global CO2 emissions, one of the key questions is, of course, when does fossil fuel demand peak? When can we expect a reduction? And we've been hoping for that in this discussion for many, many years. It hasn't happened yet. We had a peak coal demand some while back. Oil demand has peaked in the industrialized world, but it continues to grow in the rest of the world. So, and then in the worst case, we have a peak oil demand close to 2030, which is roughly in line with the central scenario from IEA as well. Gas demand will continue to grow for another decade, roughly. Coal demand we're roughly at the peak of coal demand in the worst case. And then, of course, if we're to go towards and to develop towards a 1.5 degree world, we'll have to make that peak come much closer and also make this subsequent decline in demand much faster once you've passed the peak. And that's about developing sufficient alternatives so that you and I can change from using fossil fuels to using something else and having our energy demand satisfied. And that is, of course, how quickly can that happen, both in transport, in heating, cooling, in manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then as part of that, of course, it's as Anise alluded to, and what's your specialty is how quickly will electricity as a final source of energy consumption replace and take over the non-electricity parts, right? Currently, 80% of our energy use is not electricity. It's about burning molecules directly. And then roughly by every decade, electricity grows by roughly a percentage point historically. That has to speed up and will speed up. But will we get to 2050 with maybe 50% of global energy use being electricity? That's the big question. And then, of course, if we're to go there and that's going to be sustainable, then we have to make sure that all that new electricity doesn't emit CO2. So then that has to be renewable electricity in terms of wind, solar, nuclear, hydro, and not burning coal and gas to produce electricity, at least not without carbon capture and storage. And we think there's a definite role for carbon capture and storage, especially in the bridges scenario. So in a 1.5 degree world, we think we have to, because we will not be able to switch out of burning hydrocarbon molecules sufficiently fast. And since we don't, human beings will continue to contribute to global warming by having much lower emissions than today, but still have emissions. And in order to eliminate that warming impact, we'll have to take out those carbon molecules. And we actually think in the bridges scenario that we'll have to take out more carbon out of the air to stay within the 1.5 degree budget around 2045 and onwards. So we'll have to take out more carbon than we emit. which is going to be a massive challenge.
Yeah, it seems like you're picking up some really important themes there. Perhaps we could dig into a few of them in a bit more detail, Eirik. I know Anise was keen to ask you, particularly around what you just mentioned about the role of CCS and also about the fossil fuel demand. So maybe if you had some questions there, Anise, you can come in.
Yeah, I was interested in the topic because we at Aurora always get asked the question, when do you see coal demand peaking and when do you see gas demand peaking? And it was really a big exercise for us because we did have the concept of CCS that we could add to the model. And we were thinking about how is fossil fuel demand going to evolve? I noticed in your scenario that you do assume in bridges a pretty strong uptake in how much carbon is stored underground or used between now and 2030, which I saw was a bit more bullish than our scenarios, for example, as well as the IEA scenario. So what are you assuming happens in the next decade? And in the period after 2030, it's kind of similar to other scenarios, but yeah, I was really interested in what's happening in the short term.
Yeah, no, that is the dilemma of having a normative backcast where we put on ourselves the restriction that we have to stay within the carbon budget for a 1.5 degree warming, which leaves about 450 billion tons of remaining CO2 from the energy sector from 2020 and onwards. And when you look at where we are now, we're getting close to that threshold. And then there's no way around putting in place things that will take those CO2 emissions rapidly down. And when you combine that with, so that means that we have a very aggressive assumption, some would say, for instance, on growth in nuclear electricity the next decade. IEA has the same, by the way. Because there's no way we see renewable electricity being able to step up sufficiently fast to take out unabated coal, unabated gas sufficiently fast. And there, in addition, we'll have to assume carbon capture and storage in order to run the electricity system with those low emission rates. If we had given ourselves slightly more time with an overshoot, or in your case, a 2 degree scenario, then you can wait. Then you don't need that type of assumptions, even in a normative scenario. So that is one of the challenges. A very large part of fossil fuel emissions is also oil. That is half of oil is used in transport, roughly 50 million barrels per day. That is really, really difficult to see how quickly that will. One thing is when it will peak. That depends on car penetration, car density in the emerging economies. It depends on the uptake of EVs and so on in new car sales. But the decline in oil demand, once it has peaked, will almost by definition be relatively slow, because it takes, a car has an economic life of 10 to 15 years. So once you've started to drive it, you'll continue to drive it, or you'll sell it to someone else who does. So that is also so that also leads to the need for technologies that can rapidly replace other sources of fossil fuel emissions or CO2 emissions in a period for 10 years, right? So and this extremely tight carbon budget, which gets tighter every year, CO2 emissions still grow, right? They're not going down. We hope that they will be flat globally over the next couple of years, but they do not go down. And that means we eat out of that budget very, very rapidly. And if you put on ourselves the assumption that we're going to stay within that budget, we have to quickly phase it out. So that's that's just a result of the modeling. Basically, this is not a forecast. This is a prediction of what is needed.
Exactly. I think that's the key point, isn't it? And it's in some sense what can we conclude from that? We can conclude. So what you've shown us is what needs to happen to stay within the 1.5 degree budget. But in your own admission, these are things that are really hard to believe. And so the sort of conclusion you get to is, I mean, I won't be the first to say it, but 1.5 degrees is a enormously aspirational target, and one which it's really hard to see how we actually achieve that in reality. I think that's where there's not to like, there's a huge value that this kind of scenario, this kind of stretch scenario brings by pointing out to policymakers what are the things that you really need to turbocharge and get going if you want to have any hope of keeping 1.5 or let's say even 1.7 degrees alive as a possibility. That's what they should be standing up and concluding from this.
Yeah, no, that is, and then I mean, it's when IEA came with their net zero emission scenario some years back, they basically assumed that that scenario started in 2020 with serious reductions in CO2 emissions, which we already had in 2020, not because of climate and energy policy, but because of COVID and ban on transport. And what's different from IEA scenario in our bridges scenario is that we do not assume that it has started. It doesn't start until 2025, 2026. There's no signal now that we will see a significant reduction in energy-related CO2 emissions anytime soon. So, but there's a hope that we can, by changes in policy, by focusing on the right things, by making sure that we have a massive growth in the investments that are needed in order to provide alternatives to fossil fuels, so that consumers can actually change. Then there's a chance. But then we have already spent 2 more years of the carbon budget out to 25, 26, and there's very little left. I mean, the climate discussion today is that with the combination of CO2 emissions and El Nino that we're facing this year, we might actually have passed the 1.5 degree threshold this year. We might come back below in a couple of years as well, but because of the combination of effects, right?
Yeah.
So that is, but of course, both in the wall scenario, which is the forecast, a lot of good things are happening, but it's just that making the world change sufficiently fast is an enormous task when global energy systems are growing. People's purchasing power are increasing. The average size of an apartment in New Delhi now is a new apartment is 10 square meters larger than it was 10 years ago. That means 25 cubic meters more to cool in June and July and to heat in the winter. That leads to increased energy demand, increased demand for electricity. And there's not sufficient renewable electricity in India to make that happen without increasing CO2 emissions, especially when the Europeans decide to take all the global LNG that could otherwise have gone to Asia last year, and then Asians start using more coal instead, right, and build coal-fired power plants. So that's the reality.
Yeah, to pick up on one of those realities, Eirik, so you talk about electrification, and you've touched on it a few times in passing, but you're sort of saying, look, we're going to need vastly more electricity than we did in the past, but and you're assuming a big growth in renewables, but also we can come on to a rapid expansion of nuclear. Can you give us a sense of scale of that? Like, how much faster do we need to be building renewables in the bridges scenario than we have been in, let's say, the last decade?
Yeah, well, using the numbers in terms of investments, I agree with IEA, who are much better at looking at the investment figures than we are. They have much better data on that than we have. I mean, currently we're spending about $1.7 on renewables and clean energy, if you like, in grids and all that stuff. $1.7 per dollar we spend in oil and gas and coal. That's roughly the numbers this year. If we're to be on our way to a 1.5 degree world like our bridges, so their net zero emission scenario, that difference has to go to 1 to 9 by 2030. So that, unfortunately, solar is picking up significantly, probably delivering record amounts of new capacity. Wind is not, because the cost increases after COVID has made, and the interest increases and the inflation and the supply chain challenges has made that much less profitable. The number of projects are not sufficiently ready. So there's a massive competition on every project. Most of the competition in renewables, in wind in particular, is in the industrialized world, where we basically do not need new energy. We just need to replace coal-fired electricity with something else. But where are all the renewable projects that we as international oil and energy companies can invest in the emerging economies where they seriously need the electricity and the energy? Where are all the wind parks in Africa? and who's ready to invest there? Do we have the framework conditions in place, et cetera, et cetera? What about country risk? What about ownership rights? What about the corruption risk, et cetera, which is slowing down that type of transition, in particular in the emerging economies. So this is about speeding up and then speeding up again, and it is happening in our world scenario. The world scenario contains an energy transition that is much faster than what we've seen anything like over the last 30 years. But it's not sufficient to deliver on a 1.5 degree world. It's a 2.2 degree world. And then but in the bridges, relatively speaking, over the next decade, we need a revolution in our energy transition across the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wonder how, just thinking about that kind of investment challenge and how to balance investments, that must play out within Equinor itself, that you're sort of simultaneously, you want as a company to invest more in renewables, particularly in offshore wind where you have expertise, but the company is also, a major oil and gas producer, and the demand within Europe from European policymakers to produce more within your assets to fill a gap left by Russia must have been extreme over the last years. So how do you balance internally these competing demands of capital? And you want to move forward as a company towards cleaner energy, but fundamentally you're still providing fossil fuels as well.
Yeah, no, and I don't think it would be extremely irresponsible if we didn't. And especially since the world needs oil and gas to run the global economy, we need coal as well for a while. And of course, when you suddenly, like last year, when everybody is in a situation where we have to face up to the reality that 25% of European gas just disappeared, how do you do that? And fortunately, we were lucky with the weather, so the winter became less challenging than it otherwise would have been. Electricity and energy prices skyrocketed, and people felt that. That had implications also for the energy prices in Asia, et cetera, et cetera. So, but within the company, we're looking at opportunities. We don't have a mandate to lose money, so we have to believe in these projects being profitable. We invest a lot in not only renewables when we can and when we win the competitions, and some of these are serious bid competitions, right? And we can't win them all. We shouldn't. We're also investing in what we call low carbon solutions, so turning natural gas into hydrogen, combine that with CCS. We're providing Europe with CO2 storage as well, and all of this has to happen in a setting where there has to be a line of sight to making normal profits on this, risk adjusted and all that, and then that of course affects where we put our money. It's also about capacity. It's about the competitive advantages. Do we have enough people to do this? Do we have the necessary qualifications? Which is why we focus on offshore wind more than we do on onshore wind, as an example. It's why we focus more on certain geographies than others, because we already have a presence. We know the framework conditions. And all of us are, looking at the current situation where the wholesale prices for electricity in countries which has a large share of intermittent renewables, like Germany or the Netherlands, those prices turn negative hundreds of hours a year right now. That's a very bad investment signal. So what type of market design changes? What type of reform do we need in order to look at the electricity system by 2030 that makes sense for us as investors? So and that has to then that has to also be replicated in the countries that really need electricity, whether that's Brazil or it's Africa, the African countries, or it's India.
Yeah, some extra challenge there. With an eye on the clock, what I'd like to do is move us on. In a way, we've pulled out some of the key insights from the report. What I'd like to do is kind of try and tease out how likely, in a sense, is it that we get to your bridges scenario or something close to it in a 1.5 degree world? And actually, we've sort of already said that's probably quite difficult. But I'd quite like to shine a spotlight on what you see, Eirik, and also Anise, as the key barriers? So what is it that's objectively different, very different in a 1.5 degree world versus a 2 degree world? What are those key barriers as we see them now? Or to put it a different way, what would be the enablers to change TAC? What needs to happen, in a sense, to get to 1.5 rather than a 2 or 2.2 degree world?
Yeah, well, I think, and we have to remember that there's also a non-negligible probability that we might end up higher than the 2.2 degree as well, right? I mean, it's even if we think that's the most likely development, it's there's a range of outcomes both on the above that and below that. No, I think the biggest challenge with staying within the carbon budget consistent with the 1.5 degree world is the need for speed. It's the need for changing the way we use energy sufficiently rapidly, basically, and just having the availability of alternatives to fossil fuels within reach for the population that needs it the next decade, and that's what makes it so difficult and therefore so unlikely. And what would need to happen is a massive change in framework conditions that would stimulate us to change the way we use energy. Make it and then make it possible. So things like the IRA in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, is also one example to sort of kickstart that type of process. But then in a federal system like the United States, it's often not only relevant what Congress does. It's also what do the state legislators do? What do the local legislators do in terms of allowing these things to be built? The permitting processes. We don't know. We need to see the capacity of the U.S. economy to actually produce all this stuff sufficiently rapidly, especially since they want to do it themselves, because this is also part of a geopolitical context. They don't want to depend on China for having all these minerals and all these pipelines built and all the steel. So that is what has to happen, right? So that's but the other thing is that we have to make sure that the best doesn't become the enemy of the good here. A lot of the things that are going on are very positive, constructive, necessary, even if it leads us to a 2.2 or a 2.5 or a 2.0 type of world. And if we're honest about it, we don't really know where a given carbon concentration in the atmosphere will lead us in terms of temperature anyway, at least not with a decimal point accuracy by 2100. So we have to do all that stuff, and then if we can do more, fine, and then we'll move that needle in the right direction. This is not about giving up, right? Even if we can't reach the best outcome, we have to work for the good and then make that as good as possible.
I couldn't agree more.
Before I ask you about your opinion on the critical minerals, Eirik, I'll try to answer Richard's first question. So the first one was, how likely do we think we are able to reach the 1.5 degrees? The second one was, what do we think are the barriers? So at Aurora, we have our central scenario, and then we have scenarios on top of that. For our central scenario, we think, we're not climate scientists, but it lines up closely to more like a 2.4 degrees warming. So it's already more pessimistic than what you mentioned, Eirik, as the possible overshoot. It's not necessarily a business as usual scenario, because we're taking into account what do we think is most likely to happen policy wise, what do we think is most likely to happen. In terms of 1.5 degrees, I've already seen from the challenges my team has seen, the analysts and the modeling, it was already quite challenging to make the modeling for 2 degrees line up. So 1.5 degrees, it will involve a lot more pushing, particularly on the policy side, just banning certain technologies, really making investments happen. And on the topic of investments, I would probably see that as the main barrier, because decarbonizing is extremely capital intensive, and really companies are competing against each other. They don't necessarily want to make those investments now and lose their competitiveness. There are plenty of good policy targets and sanctions and guidelines given by governments, even China's latest 5-year plan. But really, I think the amount of money that needs to be invested, and as you said, Eirik, the rate of investment and how quickly we have to speed up, I would say, is the biggest barrier to reaching 1.5 degrees. But on the topic of critical minerals, I noticed you had an entirely separate report just on critical minerals. Why did you choose to dive into this topic? Did you see this as the number one obstacle to decarbonization, or what was behind this?
No, it was part of an unanswered question over the last year's reports, is to take a look at what people believe, what's the status of the knowledge in terms of critical minerals, and we focused only on what is needed for the renewable electricity part of this. So that report only covers the necessary minerals and the rare earth elements for wind and solar electricity, so there are many other topics we could go into as well, but what it addresses is also some of the factors that need the most rapid change, the capacity to deliver over the next 5 to 10 years. It fits very well into our set of critical assumptions behind our scenarios, which is the geopolitical conflict aspects of this as well. Your belief in critical mineral supply depends on your assumptions on whether that can take place in a geopolitically very benign world or not. Is it okay to trade with countries that are prone to child labor, human rights problems, or not? This fits very well with the discussions on supply chain bottlenecks as well, which is more general, where we have now a series of supply chains in the rare earth element space, which is controlled by one country, et cetera, et cetera. So there are signals now as to the owners of them, and the owners of these minerals will in an energy transition that plays out like it seems to be now, or that it has to be, will come in a similar situation as the previous owners of fossil fuels. They can get dominant market positions, right? Indonesia has been calling for a cartel on nickel, similar to OPEC. The Chilean government threatened to nationalize its lithium resources this spring. It probably won't happen. So it looks very much like an energy space also controlled by a few players. So that's why it's interesting. And of course, there might be alternative minerals out there, and we should look for those as well. This is also about how quickly can we make it more energy efficient to excavate minerals, handle the waste with very low density of usable materials, typically in a mine. It plays very well into the not in my backyard or the banana, the build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything focus that we have today, because we have to start mining in places where we don't mine today, or at least where we don't mine anymore, etc. So it's a really interesting topic that has to be addressed during the discussion on energy transition, and you can't get around it either.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading that spotlight.
No, very, very important to highlight that. As we begin to wrap up the podcast, Eirik, so we've talked a lot about the most recent Energy Perspectives report. You've been doing this a while now, though. This is your 12th one.
Too long, some would say.
I wonder, kind of, what are the changes? It might be hard to cast your mind back to the first one of these in 2011, but what were the things, if we were to compare how this has kind of evolved over time, what were the things, the new trends, the technology developments that really have caught you by surprise? And conversely, what are the themes that have just kind of never gone away and have been there the whole time?
Yeah, I think the things that are stable, the things that never go away, I guess, is this massive super tanker of a global energy system that continues to grind. It continues to grow. It continues to provide the foundation for economic growth. The only time over the last decade that we've seen a significant reduction in both energy demand, energy use, and also CO2 emissions was in 2020, when we basically crashed the global economy because of COVID, and we lost 20 million barrels of oil demand from April 2019 to April 2020. So that's the stable thing, is how do we look upon the possibilities of changing this massive system that continues to grow. The growth in purchasing power and quality of life, basically in parts of Asia, which then drives energy demand over the last decades is sort of a significant underlying trend, and it provides a very good example for what we have to cater for when we make forecasts for the next decades. Is what happens if the doubling of the African population to 2050 were to be allowed the same kind of quality of life improvements over the next 30 years as we've allowed the Chinese to have, if you like, over the last 30 years. How do you cater for that in an energy system that cannot continue to expand its use of fossil fuels? So that's the underlying sort of things that have surprised us. I guess the rapid growth in the EV development on new car sales is one. It's and in Norway we like to brag about this probably being driven partly by the Norwegian policy on this as well, as one example of what a small country can contribute to, even though we don't count anymore. But now it's the Chinese EV penetration that is the biggest one. I think also that we still don't see that making a lot of dents in global oil demand yet, right? Which is also a surprise to some. These cars tend to continue to drive, and in countries with large EV penetration, the EVs have been the extra cars. We see it now in Norway. Now oil demand goes down as a consequence of it, but we're up to 80%, 90% EV penetration in new car sales now in Norway, right? So that's where you have to go. I think, So and then I guess some of the disappointments as well is of course that things don't move sufficiently fast. We tend to be a bit optimistic on some of the technology developments coming faster than they should. We're waiting for cold fusion, or for fusion to scale up. But I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. We might get breakthroughs, but I don't think we might not see big dents in global energy mix or the way we produce electricity from that technology for decades yet, which is in a sense disappointing.
Yeah. Probably to add to that, the progress on CCS is probably in a similar category.
Yeah.
It's been, although you highlight the importance of it, the actual deployment rate has been incredibly slow.
But on that, it's a bit of both. I guess the positive surprise there has been the willingness to talk about a price on carbon.
Yeah.
And the establishment of some price systems for pricing this, and then CCS is basically handling waste, right? This is a waste product. And then how do you make sure that we handle that properly? And the only way to do that is by creating a market price, creating a cost, having people face up to the cost of this waste. And that takes a while, but the positive surprise has been that it has actually happened in Europe and some other countries or regions as well.
So Eirik, final question. We often end our podcast with the section called overrated or underrated. And I'd like to ask you, what do you see as the most underrated technology for decarbonisation?
That's the energy we don't use.
So
and we don't talk
energy efficiency,
the avoidance of using it, the avoidance of energy use, and our ability to realize that through framework conditions. And it's one of the biggest questions that I have, so fundamental questions in terms of if you have our bridges scenario in 2050, global GDP is almost twice what it is today. We have 3-4 billion middle-class consumers that are not there today. And how can we square that circle with so much less use of energy than today? What is it that people actually spend their time on? What type of behavioral changes do we need in order to realize that result? And how do we make that happen? And a large part of that is the energy efficiency, especially when we think we have to rely and will rely on electricity sources that have zero marginal cost in terms of production. How do we avoid people making much more, using much more of that during their spare time or whenever, because they have the purchasing power to do that, right?
Yeah, and I think the challenge there is in theory, in economic models, the rational person should be, or rational company should be, exploiting these efficiency gains. And if the $100 bills are falling all over the floor, then they should be able to pick those up and realize those gains. But the problem is that they don't always, and often don't. It actually, in a way, takes a huge policy push on things like product standards. That's actually, if you look at why has Europe, for example, reduced its energy use, a lot of it is due to things like product standards. I guess you could also point to the invention of the LED light bulb as being a good one. So it can be technology change as well. But I think the challenge is in your Bridges scenario, or in any accelerated decarbonisation scenario, the rate of change of that efficiency improvement has to dramatically change versus anything we've ever seen before.
Yeah, and it's the rate of change also after counting in the income effect of this, or the comfort factor, right? I mean, it's the behavioral change.
Indeed.
It's how much more streaming of digital information will we do, and what's the electricity demand consequence of that? It's just look at the electricity use or the energy use now on everything that we didn't know what was in 2010 in terms of Netflix and Bitcoin mining and whatever else, right? And artificial intelligence going forward is going to help us, but it's also going to make it much more difficult, because we're going to use so much more data power.
Yeah. Well, Eirik, I think let's wrap up there. It's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. I think you and your team do a great job in distilling a lot of complexity down into those energy perspective reports. So keep up the great work, and I'm sure we'll continue to engage with you and your team. Thanks also to Anise for joining on the podcast, and we look forward to your own, the Aurora scenarios report to come out in a few weeks' time. So thank you both. We'll end there.
Thank you. And we also look forward to the Aurora scenario report.
Very good. Maybe you can come back and critique that one, Eirik.
Exactly.
Yes,
I'll try that.
Very good. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
That was Richard Howard, Aurora's Global Research Director, talking to Eirik Wærness, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at Equinor, and Anise Ganbold, Aurora's Head of Research. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.